All right, there we go. So let's get started on our journey to IPPs. Now, to be completely honest, I was a little bit, I try to make my presentations as fun as possible. And let's be honest, talking about IPPs is not the way that we all want to spend our Thursday afternoon. At least I don't, other than being here with you guys, but it's usually not the choice. It's usually not the top choice of what we want to be doing with our time. But that being said, it's a really important part of our work together here as educators. And so I'm really passionate about IPPs and the good work that they can do. I am also very, very passionate about the harm that they can do. So we want to really be aware of the full spectrum of IPPs, IEPs, ISPs, whatever you call them in your district, and how we can make this the best experience possible for the children and families that we serve in education. To give you a little bit of background as to why I'm giving this presentation and who I am. So I am an educator first. So I graduated from the University of Alberta with an elementary education degree in 2005. Prior to that, I was an educational assistant in St. Albert Public Schools for 5 years. Then I went to school, graduated, and I took a job in the nonprofit sector working for a program called Connect Society here in Edmonton. And I taught there for 10 years, and it is a PUF program that provides supports for children affected with hearing loss. So either they have a hearing loss or someone in their family does. Within that grouping, so working a lot with children with all degrees of hearing loss, I also then was working with children with other challenges to their life. So that might be a medical diagnosis, autism, Down syndrome, you name it. In those 10 years, I did a lot of work with little kids that needed a lot of help. So I've written probably hundreds of IPPs at this point. So I'd like to say that I'm fairly well versed. Again, that being said, the last time I've been responsible for a grade 4, 5, 6 IPP has been a very long time. So I have some homework to do there, but this is still the basics of the legal requirements around IPPs in Alberta. So we'll still be able to hit those marks for you. After working at Connect Society for 10 years, I moved on to Aboriginal Head Start here in Edmonton that provides Head Start services for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children in Edmonton. We have 3 classrooms and we can serve up to 144 children in those classrooms. And I am an inclusive education coordinator there. So I oversee literally all the IPPs, and the majority of our children are coded within the PUF or mild mod categories. So again, I went from writing the IPPs myself to overseeing the writing of the IPPs and the implementation. I also work with our therapist team. Fairly knowledgeable on what it takes to be coded to then receive an IPP. So kind of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes around funding, and then how that all comes to fruition with an IPP. Okay. During COVID, I went back to school and gained my master's in counseling psychology. So I'm also a mental health therapist. So I also see this work through the lens of advocacy and what is best for those children with needs in our classrooms, and how the IPP can be a tool to help support them there. Okay, so, all right. So the first place that we need to look when it comes to working in Alberta and working within IPPs is the standards for special education. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is that the date of this document is June 2004. So it is almost a 20-year-old document, and it has yet to be updated. When I was working on this presentation and doing research around this presentation, I searched high and low to make sure that I was not missing a more recent document. And as far as I could find, this is the most recent model around standards for special education that we are using in Alberta. Okay, so first and foremost, I think it's really important to look at, what we're being asked to do as teachers, and having fidelity towards that model that we're being asked to work under, but then also just always looking at, you know, how are we having the best outcomes for the children in our program, okay? So we're looking at this document because it gives us the definition of special education that we are using in Alberta. So it refers to the educations of students with mild, moderate, or severe disabilities, or those who are gifted and talented. So those categorizations come from the DSM, well, used to be 4, now it's 5. So the DSM is something that we, mental health therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists use to diagnose concerns for people, okay? So it is the belief within Alberta in special education that all children can reach their potential if they are provided the proper environment to do so. So the IPP is really that tool, it's that foundation that everything kind of wraps around or spreads from in order to make sure that children are getting what they need, okay? The link to the Google document or the Google Drive in the chat, and I will put it back in for those people that just arrived. You will find a copy of the standards for special education. You can also download it for free. I do recommend that you read through it, especially if you're being tasked with working with children who have codes, so that you understand the philosophy behind how Alberta education sees us providing education for these children, okay? So special education in Alberta is based on an inclusion model. So you'll see the diagram on the right, and that's from the Alberta Teachers Association. We look at how education has changed through the years, through the decades, for people with extra needs. So we go all the way back to where you know, folks just didn't get an education at that point, right? They were put into institutions or weren't even supported at all, okay? Then we moved to segregation, then into categorization, and then into integration, where, you know, children might join for a class or two. Then we looked at mainstreaming and then inclusion. Now, sometimes this is also just an argument in semantics of what are we actually talking about when we look at these categories of how to provide education for everybody, okay? When we're working in Alberta, we're working within an inclusion model. So inclusion refers to not just the setting, but specifically designed instruction and support for those children who need it. And guess what? That's everybody. So everybody needs, you know, what they need in order to succeed in school. And then we are going to have certain children in our classroom where if we were to do the same thing, it's not going to land for those kids. Okay, so then, and that might be because of a diagnosed learning disability, hearing loss, vision loss. There's lots of different reasons, and we'll go through that when we look at the special ed coding manual. Okay. Again, when you're in the Google Drive, you have access to these slides. You can click on this link down here that has some resources on the history of inclusion in Canada, if you are so interested. Okay. Fast forward to 2014. So we've been working on inclusion for about 10 years at this point. And the ATA looked at, okay, well, what are we actually doing when it comes to inclusion? And so they had a panel of experts looking at the concerns that were coming around inclusive education. And then this resulted in some recommendations from Alberta Education. And it focused on everything from like leadership. So I know we have some leaders and admin in the room today, to frontline teaching, and then everything in between. And that might include therapists and support staff as well. Okay. So inclusion is not this thing that we can just stick a pin in and say that it's perfect. It continues to be an evolving process, okay? So Inclusion Canada is another resource that you can look to learn more about how inclusion is, how we're kind of doing when we talk about inclusion in Canada. According to them, in a very recent piece of research, 60% of children and youth with intellectual disabilities are denied the right to inclusive quality education. Now, this could be because of a number of reasons. The first and foremost one I think that comes to mind is lack of resources. So especially because Canada, we have so much space that as soon as you get outside of a main urban center, those resources become less and less and less. So sometimes it's not because of a lack of desire or wanting to or trying to. It could just simply be a lack of resources. So again, we want to look at some of this information through that lens of absolutely, there are going to be children in places where it's highly resourced and still not getting what they need because of X, Y, and Z. And there's going to be people teaching in places where you're just like, I want to do more for this kid, but it's not there. Okay. So just knowing that there's, again, this wide range of what we're looking at in inclusion. And I guess the main point of this is being aware of like what you can do as a teacher, because you're only in control of what you can control. So one of the things that you have a lot of control over, if not sole control over, other than working with in collaboration with your teaching team, whoever that may be, the parents and the child, is the IPP. So you really actually have a lot of power and influence and control over how good that child's educational experience can be simply by the work that we put into the IPP. Okay. All right. So looking at the concept of inclusion and some of the definitions. So we can look at, these are some of the terms that are used within this field. So adapted programming. So how are we adjusting what school looks like for all of our children, including the ones that have an IPP? Assessment. So if it has an IPP, an assessment would have taken place. So what does that assessment data look like? Do I have access to those reports? Do I know how to read those reports, right? I've heard from a number of teachers now, and especially educational students, that, you know, I have a kid on an IPP and I don't know why they're on it. I don't know, you know, what data was used to put them on it. I don't know what this assessment means. I don't know what this assessment data means, okay? And that most likely will be a whole other chat. If you get interested, you think that that might be a good idea to talk about assessment and what leads a child to an IPP, let me know in the chat and I can definitely work on that for you guys. Consultation. So when we're looking at providing specialized program for children, it's a team approach. We cannot do this alone. So one of the legal requirements of an IPP is consulting with teachers and then collaborating with the whole school environment to make that a successful document. Again, diagnostic information, that comes from the assessments. Early identification. So we know for a fact that the earlier that we can identify challenges, the better off our outcomes are going to be, okay? We also know from a fiscal point of view that it's true. So the earlier that we can get these kiddos identified and give them the supports that are going to help them be successful, the better off that everybody is going to be. So for those of you that are working, I saw that we have no early educators in the room, but even that grades 1, 2, 3, right? As soon as you notice, you're like, that kiddo's really struggling here. Who do I need to talk to advocate for the needs for this child? Okay. Okay. Interested in the idea of how a child receives an IPP? Absolutely, Phil. One vote is enough. I'm just going to pause and write that down. If we end up with time at the end, or if anybody wants to stay late, I can show you the process of what we do at Aboriginal Head Start, which is probably fairly similar to other programs. I have a flow chart that we can just go through quickly, but I could take that and develop it into an hour-long presentation. Absolutely, Phil. Thank you. Inclusive setting and inclusion in general. So the definition is there for you to see. Again, all of these were pulled from that document from 2004. So it probably needs some updating, but using what's at hand and what is required of you legally teaching in Alberta. Okay. So how does an IPP, this document, support inclusion? So it provides the opportunity to create a common language. Okay, so if you can even imagine, visualize, we're all sitting around a table in support of that child, and we're all looking at the exact same document that says, this child would benefit based on research, based on experience, based on talking with the family and the child, if the child is old enough, and they, you know, even in grade 1, I think a child is able to contribute to their IPP. These are the ways that we're going to help them be successful okay? The definition of success is also a whole other piece. And I'm actually going to write that down. So how do we define success for children in schools? Because I think it goes past academics, right? So how do we make a really well-rounded document too? Okay. So that leads me to the graphic that you see on the left-hand side. So this is all about supporting valued experiences. So you can go around that star, if you will, and each one of these pieces is a part of inclusion, okay? So I think often we get stuck into, and especially as you get into higher and higher grades, of focusing only on the intellectual and academic portions of an IPP. Whereas if we were to talk to kids, and I'll give you an example, today I was talking with a client of mine, a teenager, autism, ADHD, very high functioning, takes AP classes as well, and is on an IPP. And when I talked to him today about, he has some social anxiety, so we're talking about getting ready to go back to school and what are the strategies we need to have in place and all of these things. And the most important part for him is seeing his friends. Now, is social skills and social environment and contributing socially in his IPP? No. So, already there we have a disconnect of, this is a child that also really highly values academics and is an AP and has a goal for himself to go on to university. But that most important part for him, the social aspect, isn't in his IPP, right? So this graphic could be really helpful for those of you who are also either just starting to write IPPs or want to get better at it, of, are these elements included in the programming that I'm providing? Okay. Again, that's just a jumping off point, and you can find more resources specifically on inclusion at the link below. Okay. So the definition of an IPP. So the IPP is a plan of action designed to address students' special education needs that is based on diagnostic information and provides a basis for the strategies that we are going to use to intervene. So intervene literally, like if I were to step in front of a child and change something, how is that change going to benefit them? Okay. All of the information should be essential that's in the IPP. There should be no extraneous. Okay. There should be no fluff. It should be very, this is exactly what we need to do in our experience and in evidence to support this child. Requires planning and preparation for proper implementation. Okay. So what does that look like? Okay. So the process must include informed consent. And I find that this is the step that is most often missed. Okay. So informed consent. So that means that everybody agrees in writing to what is being carried out for the student. You may have to then take this back to your administration and ask, what does informed consent for an IPP look like here? Now, some of this might be happening behind the scenes, and you as the frontline teacher, you just get this list of, these are the kids that require IPPs. Again, I'm not familiar with how every single board or district does this. Working in the nonprofit sector, this is something that I task my teachers with because it can be such an important piece of rapport building with the families as well, in that this is your opportunity to gather information from the source, from the parents, from the caregivers, and what their life is like outside of school, and then also provide that information of this is what it's like inside of school, and where can we meet in the middle so that this IPP is, again, well-rounded and value-based, okay? Consent is voluntary and may be withdrawn at any time. So just because a child comes into your program and has a need, that does not mean that the parents need to consent to an IPP, okay? And if they don't consent to that, then that should go to your administration, because that might be then affecting kind of how they are coded within the Alberta education framework, okay? But really important that you have that consent. So again, if you're a teacher and you don't understand the consent process with wherever you are working, gather that information. This is protection for you, for the student, and for the parents to make sure that everybody knows what's going on, okay? If you're an administrator, here listening in today, and maybe you're new to your job, or maybe you're not aware of what's going on, this is a perfect opportunity to have a chat, okay? If you go into the Google Drive, you will see, and we can go there quickly right now. So if we go into the Google Drive, we will find a sample of what this can look like. So this is something that I created for my teachers at Head Start. And it's exactly what it says, informed IPP planning. So I just kind of went through, again, from my experience of gathering information, and I just was like, what would I want to know as a teacher about a child that might help me write the best IPP for them? And this is you having a chat with the caregiver, right? What are their goals? I think sometimes we really forget, like, what do the parents really want? Now, sometimes you're going to get parents that say, I don't have any, I don't think my child has any challenges. That's also then your opportunity to advocate for that child's experience in the school. It's your ability to talk from expertise with compassion to say, hey, you know, that's great that that's how you see your child. And this is where I see that if we do a little bit of work here, here, and here and set some goals, we're really going to have a successful year, okay? So a lot of this is around rapport building. Part of what I learned in becoming a therapist, and continues to support this again and again and again, that the most important piece of any sort of therapy, and I would include education in that because education is therapeutic in that we're continuing to learn and grow and evolve, is the relationship you have with whoever that person is, therapist, educator, educational assistant, principal, okay? The most important part is your relationship with them. So if we don't have a good positive relationship with the caregiver at home, you know, is our IPP going to be as successful? Maybe, maybe not, but it doesn't hurt to have good rapport with the caregivers, okay? So again, this is based on a PUF program. You could also then copy this and make it more specific to your age group. And then at the bottom, I always just make sure that I sign it or the teacher signs it, and then it's saved in the child's file. So this is just a written record of, and I would let the parents know, I'm going to make note of this. This is going to be in the child's record, you know, and all a part of that informed consent process. Okay. Okay, so let's go back to our slides. If you have any questions while I'm chatting, please feel free to just pop them into the chat. I'm pretty good at monitoring both things at the same time, so please feel free to do that. Okay. Okay. Okay, so we arrive at school, we're getting rolling with teaching. We find out that we have some kids in our class that need an IPP. Now what? Okay, so remember a few slides back, it takes planning and preparation to be able to write an IPP. Okay, so the first step is that informed consent and information gathering. So in that information gathering phase, you also can ask the parents, you know, do you have any other assessments that I should know about? Things like that, so that you have the most well-rounded piece of information that you can have, okay? I just love this quote specifically for this because an IPP can feel like a very big thing. Granted, the longer you do them, the more you are going to develop systems that work for you in order to manage this information, okay? Every year that I've done IPP, my systems have shifted slightly to make it a little bit easier and a little bit more efficient. But if you're just starting out, IPPs are going to take you some time. You are going to be writing them at home. Like that's just part of the job. It's part of learning, right? Like you can't expect to be a first-year teacher and write an IPP and be done in a half an hour and, you know, that's that. It's similar to lesson planning, right? This takes time to evolve, but first and foremost, break that into small steps and then take that small step right away. So if I can encourage anything, as soon as you get that list of, okay, these are the children who need IPPs, just start fact finding. Why do they need an IPP? What assessment is it based on? contact those caregivers about it, get that ball rolling, because that momentum is going to help you help carry you into the actual act of sitting in a computer and getting that information down. Okay. The IPP writing process is student focused. And although we like to say this, I'm sure many of us have been in a situation where we're maybe looking at an IPP, or we've gotten an IPP from years past and you're like, this does not feel student focused. Okay. So it also involves relationships that should ripple out from this IPP and from just the classroom itself. In that, if we go back to that values-based, this star, okay, are we including everything or as much of this as possible? Okay, and when we look at community, that's your school community. Okay, so am I really trying to kind of envelop this student in the process? Okay, it's a shared vision about why we serve students. Okay, so this also involves your belief as a teacher. Do you even serve students in the first place? Okay, and what is it about this process that's important for you in order to make a positive impact, and then have that belief in their success and their achievement? Now, as early as possible, I would start teaching children to advocate for themselves and their IPP. Okay, so as early as possible, and you could even do this with possibly grades 1s and 2s, of sitting down and just talking to them about what's most important to them when they come to school. They may say things like, you know, I like center time, I like playing in the sandbox, I like coloring, I like going to gym class, right? All of these things that we know that most children really, really like. Finding a way to use that in your IPPs, whether those are part of your strategies, things like that, will help that child be more successful. Okay. Okay. So remembering your underlying values and beliefs and checking your biases wherever they are. Okay. Not everybody here is going to have a vast amount of experience in working in special education. My whole career has been in special education. Okay. And I still have to check my biases around, you know, even within that layer of, you know, assuming that every child with a diagnosis of autism is going to present the same and need the same types of goals, for example. Okay. So your attitudes, motivation, and commitment are choices that you make. So how you approach this IPP is a choice. Okay. Now, what is going to affect choice is going to be your experience, your resources, the support that you get from your administration and your program, things like that, right? So it's taking on that personal leadership towards having this IPP become something that's a really positive tool for this child. Okay. And these are just some questions for reflection. So again, like just asking yourself this, okay, you know, what are the essential elements of my IPP, and how do I make sure that they, you know, that all of those elements are being met across the student's day, for example. Okay. Okay. So what is an IPP? So it's developed to address specific needs of individual children. It is individual. Okay. We talk about goal banks when we look at writing goals. I've used goal banks, and I actually went away from using goal banks, and I would literally sit and handwrite and handcraft with the help of my therapist each goal for each child. Now it took way longer, but I felt it was more specific IPP for that individual. I am aware of, but have not used myself, that some districts have like a computer program that you go in and it's a little bit more of like a click and select type goals. Again, you know, those goals came from somewhere, so they were individualized at some point, but just really making sure, okay, if I have to select from a certain menu of goals in my school district, where else within this IPP can I make it individual? That will be your comments, like really spending time writing out specific comments, sharing specific examples, things like that, to really try and make it as individualized as possible. It's collaborative. So again, working with the whole team, who all is involved with this child, so that it can be as collaborative as possible. Also, We know that like most problems come from a communication breakdown. So whoever you're working with that is a touch point for this child in your school and then possibly outside, just kind of depending on the goals and the setting for this child, making sure that you guys are communicating. Does everybody have access to the document? Are you reviewing it regularly? And more so than just to, you know, click progressing, right? It's a planning document. So it's used for monitoring and evaluating progress. Okay, so again, an IPP should be a living document, and it's something that you should be able to go in daily if you had the time and the resources and make subtle adjustments if necessary. That's kind of how I like to see it. It's a communication document. This is one of our main tools that we have to show this child came to us with this diagnosis. This is our plan, and this is how far we've gotten. Okay, so I like to think of it as kind of a roadmap as well. It summarizes the work of a year. Okay, it also summarizes what accommodations that child has had, what worked and what didn't. Okay, I think it's really important to highlight, especially at the end of your summary, what didn't work for that child, that when they leave you, your legacy is making sure that that child does not have to go through that again, that which is, I think I know better than this other teacher and this is going to work for you, when it didn't. Okay. Guide for transition planning, and that's a specific part of the IPP that must be included. Okay, so these are all the essential pieces that go into an IPP. Again, Alberta Education has a whole 100-page document on what are the legal requirements for an IPP. Again, this hour-long presentation is not enough to go into every single one of these pieces. If you think that that would be good as a presentation, I'd be happy to put that together for you. So again, type that into the chat if that's something that you would like to see offered. But when we go through the IPP, these are all of the pieces that are required. Now, if you are working in a school board or a school district, pretty much any program that is receiving funds from Alberta Education for a child with a special ed code, they will already have a template made for you. Okay, you do not get to have license change that template. All of these pieces need to be in there so that when your school or your program gets audited for their special needs students, what is required is that that IPP gets submitted to Alberta Education and they go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And if anything's missing, it's going to be coming back to you. And I don't know about you, but most of us teachers are perfectionists. I do not want any of my IPPs coming back. Okay, so what I do encourage you to do is to look at the templates that are being provided for you from your employer and make sure that all of these pieces are on there. Okay, if you see something that's missing, have it put back in. Okay, again, this all comes from the document from Alberta Education, and I can bring that up right now. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, so this is the document. Again, it's in that Google Drive. You can also download it. Look, 572 pages, people. It's a lot more than what I can do. I will share it with you. 1 second. That's a lot more than what I can do in an hour. Okay, so that being said, I've been through this document a number of times. Again, 2006, things need an update. I haven't heard if there's going to be an update anytime soon. Okay, but this literally walks you through every single tiny piece of an IPP. Okay, which this so this presentation I'm giving is based directly on this. Okay, so if you're worried about having or missing information in your IPP, I recommend that you take a look at this document and make yourself familiar with what is required. Okay. Okay, so we will go back to the slideshow. Okay, so steps in the IPP process. Okay, again, there might be multiple little steps underneath this. These are the basics. Okay, so I have my list of kids. I've contacted the caregivers. Now I'm looking at, okay, what are we actually looking at? I maybe have some assessment data in front of me, and I know this kid because they've been in my class for a little bit. Okay, What are the strengths in the areas of need? And the most important part of this is based on, yes, the assessment data. You cannot ignore that because that's what's gotten that child that funding. But what then does this look like in my classroom? Where is this, child doing really well in my classroom, and where do they need help? And getting very specific on that, okay? Then we set the direction for what that IPP is going to look like moving forward. I create a plan. Again, these are all systems that you're going to want to develop for yourself, okay? Implementing the plan, we're going to go into these in detail. We're going to review and revise it, and then we're going to plan for transition, meaning when I'm no longer responsible for this IPP, what is my legacy that I'm leaving for this child? Okay, so strengths and areas of need, okay? So using a strengths-based approach that emphasizes existing strengths, capabilities, and resources, okay? Resources is a very important part of this. And I already talked about it before, that if you're working in a school district that has low resources and you're writing an IPP and you have this whole grandiose wish list of all the best things that could help this kid, and if you put it in that IPP and it's not actually feasible, eek, okay? So really looking at what are the resources that are available, what resources are missing from this child's life and what can we do about that? And that may also include outside of the school. So for example, if you have a young kiddo who requires support outside in the programming, maybe you can help them guide them towards FSCD, for example, where they can get family-based supports in the community, okay? Are your strengths and mentally based, not age-based? What is the developmental level of that child? And is what I'm seeing based on their level of development? Is there a process about it? It's not static, it's not fixed, okay? I'm careful about the language that I'm using to make sure that it's strengths-based. Can I see the opportunities within this list? Does it give hope for this child? And is it solution focused? If you put an area of need, you better have a way that you're going to work on it. Okay. So, strengths-based practice comes from a belief that every student has potential, and then we focus on what we can do, okay? And challenges open us up for curiosity and exploration. So again, be careful about the language that you use because that is what the reality will be for that child. Change is inevitable and all students can be successful. So what is your role in that level of success? Authentic relationships. Again, rapport is actually the #1 piece of all of this, okay? Is this IPP contributing to the self-esteem and self-worth of that child? Am I improving their confidence? And most likely you're going to be more successful with that if you're starting from a good place already. What are they already good at? Capacity building can be both a process and a goal. Okay, so sometimes we'll have goals where we're building capacity for XYZ. That can be an end goal, but also what is the process? Okay, we're slowly filling up a jug, so to speak, of this child's ability. And value the differences that exist within this child and their environment and the need to collaborate with everybody that, again, has interaction with the child, okay? You can go to Alberta Mentoring. I have the references at the end of this presentation that look at the types of language that we use. And you can start to eliminate the deficit-based language on the right-hand side and replace it with some strength-based concepts on the left. Handy little list to help when you're writing IPPs. Okay, so we've got our strengths and our weaknesses, areas of need. Now we're going to set our direction. So what are our priorities that will help this child be successful? Okay. Okay, just checking the chat, sorry. Okay, so the comment in the chat is about updating the IPP process after the pandemic. Absolutely. And I think it's important to note that although the pandemic had the capacity to affect everybody. It didn't affect everybody in the same way. And again, that brings us back down to this is an individualized process. And absolutely, I was actually looking at some research before I came on here around how there's a recent paper on COVID-19 and how it specifically affected adolescents and their development. So yes, become familiarized with that. And I'll actually write that down as another presentation idea of COVID impacts in education, because also there are many people out there that don't feel like it really changed things that much, right? So I think looking at what the research is saying right now around how COVID impacted children in schools and how we should then be adapting what we're doing in order to meet those needs. So that's a great comment. Thank you for making that. Okay, so what is critical for a student's success and what should we consider? Okay, so how can this skill be used in other areas and settings? So this is just broadening our scope of like, how are we helping this child across all areas of their life, not just in my math class, for example. Okay, can we relate the goal areas to areas of strengths? Can we look long-term? How is this helping this child overall? Can this transfer to other subject areas? That one's really important because it can reduce the total number of goals that you have that will actually make it more successful, okay? And then what are the child's future career goals and how am I, in grade 3 working on math goals? How is this gonna help this child eventually if I could project into the future when they're 30, for example, okay? Okay, so then we create a plan, okay? So student needs and strengths and the priority areas have been identified. And then we develop long-term goals and short-term objectives from that. So our long-term goals are broad statements about achievement. Short-term objectives are small measurable goals that will lead up to the long goal. So we look to have 2 to 5 long-term goals and about 3 to 5 short-term objectives. Now that is arbitrary. I've had children who are very complex that end up having lots and lots of goals because that's what's ethically appropriate for them in the program. I've had IPPs where a student has 2 goals, okay? Talk to your administration, what is the expectation, look at all the data that you have, try and boil it down to the most, what is the most priority? You might have a whole other list of goals that are kind of floating in the wings. Maybe they achieve something and you can slot it in. Be very aware of how many goals that you're also tasking yourself with to ethically be able to achieve in your school year, okay? And then we're going to implement the plan, okay? So we're going to review the content of the IPP and how am I measuring that progress? I'm going to add strategies and then I'm going to implement them. So what does this actually look like in the classroom? And then I'm going to adjust it as needed. So you might go through and write your IPP and then a couple weeks later realize that you were slightly off. It is absolutely okay and arguably more ethical to go in and change that IPP and inform all stakeholders versus not changing it, okay? The IPP should change and grow with the child. One note about SMART goals. So in my master's, we looked at goal setting from a therapist. And so I actually looked at some of the research around SMART goals. Just to let you know, SMART goals were actually developed for the business setting. So when you start to learn about that, you're like, I guess that actually makes sense. And SMART goals, I never remember the full acronym. Someone can type it in the chat if they know it off by heart, but they're measurable, they're achievable, they're timely, things like that. Oh, somebody did it for me. Oh, do the goals not have to be related to the diagnosis? Absolutely, they do, but they also have to be achievable within the classroom and they have to be relevant to the child's development and how they are working within the environment in the classroom. So say, for example, you have a diagnosis of an expressive language delay, okay? So an expressive language delay could mean a number of things. So looking specifically at what the diagnostician has recommended, but then how does that look in your classroom? So there might be a whole list of recommendations in an assessment report, but you might read that and you're like, well, that's not how this kid shows up in my classroom. So then the goals have to fit both the diagnosis and how the child fits in your classroom. Let me know if that answers your question, Carmen. And Philip, thank you. Smart, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time limited. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. Perfect, Carmen, thank you. There's nothing wrong with those goals. I'm a nerd, and I was just like, I wonder if there's anything else out there. And also knowing that it came from the business field of the 1980s, and then was then kind of morphed, it went through the whole kind of self-help field, and then all of a sudden we're writing SMART goals in education. I just like to ask why. I'm just curious like that. So then I also found this more recent research around making goals around success. Now, Rutledge created these around personal health, but you can see how these might help you in your goal setting process. Are they subjective? Are they personal for that kid? Absolutely. Are they urgent? Like, can I take immediate action on this goal today? Or does it take a lot of prep? Okay. Am I committed to helping this child achieve this goal? Are they concrete? Are they very specific? How can I evaluate this goal? That's a big one. Teachers often mess up that one. So be careful on how you're actually measuring the goal. Are they shared? So that's automatic in an IPP, but then am I communicating on these goals regularly? That's the shared part that's often missing. And then what does the support look like? So again, in this model, it was like, can I get the help of a therapist or a trainer or something? You are the support, but what support do you have in achieving this goal for these kids? Again, that's all that collaboration piece, okay? All right. One other model that I want to mention around goal setting is Socratic questioning. I know many teachers are familiar with this because it's something that we're starting to use in schools more and more around critical thinking. Using these 8 elements, so some people kind of put them in a hierarchy. This researcher was saying, hey, we can also put them on a wheel so that we can move between them and we can start anywhere, okay? What is the problem? What data do I have? What is my interpretation of that? Which is huge for teachers. Can I get my bias out of the way of that interpretation? What concepts are required here, et cetera, et cetera. So just another way to think about goal setting, just in support of your learning around IPPs. And then we review and revise. So regular intervals for review will be set by your school, your program, your district, okay? But you should be reviewing regularly and most likely weekly, depending on the program and the child that you have, to make sure that you're on track, okay? Regular discussions with everyone. The year-end review, make sure you add recommendations. What would you like the next teacher to know about this child to continue their success? Okay, and then adjust as needed. All right, and then planning for transition. So what might that child need to be successful in the future? And then develop a plan on how that child might acquire those skills and attitudes in the future. Okay, so this can look like, so we typically transition into kindergarten. So what would I want a kindergarten teacher to know about this child to make sure that they would be most successful? Okay, and then including any strategies that would be. So what does a sample IPP look like for Alberta education standards? Okay, so I know that this is really small, but again, you can, Alberta Education has sample IPPs on their website as well. So you can just type that in. And then there's also sample IPPs in that big 600-page document that's in the Google Drive about writing IPPs specifically, okay? I tried to just create a very basic pared down, simple version, just so you can see that everything is on there, okay? So you have all of the students' demographic information, okay? Then you have their background information from a classroom context. So this is everybody who's involved with them at the school. And then you have the background information that you gathered through that parent interview and or through your informed consent process, okay? So this tells the whole story of the child. Here we have their strengths and their areas of need, okay? Are there any medical conditions that impact schooling? In particular, there are some special ed codes that are specific to medical conditions, okay? There are also some that are not, but if it impacts them in their schooling, it should be shared here. Please know that if it does not impact their schooling, it should not be shared. That's not your information to share, only if it impacts schooling. And that will come from a conversation with the parents. Here's your assessment data, okay? Current level of performance and achievement, and then your year-end summary. This is obviously, you would fill this in May or June, and then any other coordinated support services. So what does the team look like around this child? And then you would have your goals. How am I going to assess their progress and what is their progress? Accommodations and strategies. Okay. Then you're going to plan for transition and have signatures. Okay. Here's an IPP planning checklist from that big document that I showed you. Again, you can also make your own systems around this. So they're all already done though, okay? And references, again, at the end of the presentation for you, should you want to look up any of those pieces of information. Okay. So very, very quick. I apologize for that. We've got 2 minutes. I'm just going to go back to the Google Drive. I know that most of you are in there already, but I just want to make sure that you are aware of all of the tools that are in there for you. Okay, so go back to share my screen really quickly. Okay, so we have the special education coding criteria. Again, this might not be your job unless you're an administrator, but it's good to know just kind of how children receive the codes. Now, I emailed with Alberta the other day, the new version. So there's usually a new version every year, and it usually comes out around the end of June. It is still not out yet. So this may change this year, but they said for this year, we need to use this. Okay, so that's in there. Again, this is that big long document that has sample IPPs, sample ways to write goals. It has the whole progress or the whole process outlined for you. This is my suggestion as to the informed consent and parent portion. Again, you can use your own. Your district may also have what they want you to use. So make sure you're following whatever rules they have. You have access to my slides here. This is an extra just little thing that I included around if you have any children who have sensory-based goals. This document was made more so to help explain sensory experiences to parents, but I find that most teachers don't know much about sensory, or they don't have access to an OT or a mental health therapist to help with that. So this might help you that if you have a child that, you know, an OT gives you a report and it's around sensory, this might help you in writing your goals and accommodations for that. Your standards for special ed, again, these are the rules that all of this is based on, okay? All right. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. Does anybody have any questions? I don't have to rush out. So if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to either type them in the chat, unmute yourself, raise your hand. Happy to have a conversation around, again, what else do you need? So that I can bring that back to the Edmonton Regional Learning Consortium and prepare more presentations around these topics. I wrote down the process of how a child receives an IPP, definitions of success from a student lens, and COVID impacts in education. To receive a copy of this recording, I want to say that it might get sent out to everybody who was a participant, but if you can email me if you want a copy of the presentation, and then I can follow up with you. September 14th, it's going to be a similar session to this, but it's going to be specific to working in a PUF program. Okay, PUF IPPs look very different than age grade IPPs. So that's going to be that. Now, that being said, if somebody missed this presentation and they still want to learn about IPPs, they're still going to get all this basic info. It's just going to be through the lens of a preschool teacher. So it might still be helpful for them to come, Kristen. So let them know that. I could also just redo this presentation at a later date. So if you know people who couldn't make it but wanted to be here, let me know. Lots of thank yous in the chat. Thank you guys for joining. It was a big group, so hopefully it was helpful. Again, any other suggestions around what else I can provide for you? So my role at the ERLC is around mental health, inclusive education, and early education. So if you have any needs in those areas. Okay, so email to request for the slides, yes. And the slides, you can also access them from my Google Drive. link is right there. Okay. A PUF IPP. So PUF is program unit funding, and that is for children ages 2 years, 8 months, and up to, not including, but up to 5 years old who have a special needs diagnosis. So that'll be in preschool. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Philip. Thank you for coming. Perfect. Any other questions? I'll hang out just to see, maybe things are percolating. You're welcome, Elena. You're welcome, Amara. You're welcome. I hope you have a great weekend as well. Okay, I see people slowly getting off. I'll stop the recording, but I can still wait and see